In July 1936, an ever-increasing group of men in the Spanish armed forces decided that enough was enough. The nation had been reduced to anarchy, Catholicism had been trodden all over, and estates were being actively collectivized. Communism had arrived in Spain. The odds were against these men. However, they no longer minded. To them, it was more dangerous to not rebel than to rebel, and on they went. Almost immediately, they realized that the task was actually even harder than they imagined. Francisco Franco and the best of the Spanish armed forces were stuck in Spanish Morocco, whilst Mola controlled the north of the country. If the war was to be won, then Franco and his elite troops had to get across the strait, which the Republican government had by now blockaded. The nationalists simply did not have the planes to complete an airlift, and they had to look elsewhere. Neither Franco nor Mola had any qualms about acquiring outside help, and both men independently sent out emissaries to Germany and Italy. Both nations' dictators immediately saw the logic in supporting Franco's cause and sent support. This is the story of Germany's response, the Condor Legion. A couple of quick things before we begin. First of all, this video is purely a work of history, and is in no way, shape or form political, so please don't take it that way. Thank you. Secondly, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind support, I simply would not be able to do this for a living, and I cannot thank them enough. So if you'd like to support the channel, join the Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider signing up in one of the links in the description. Thank you. Even the $2 tier helps immensely. The nationalists' only hope for success was immediately obvious. There was no hope of getting across the strait, at least in any great number. The naval aspect of the rising had been somewhat overlooked, and hundreds of naval officers had simply been butchered by their own crews, just because they were vaguely conservative, or seen as upper class. The Republicans now dominated the waters around Spain, at least on paper. An airfield had been captured in the vital city of Sevilla, and the troops had been flown in a handful at a time, but this simply wouldn't do, and it would take far too long. Franco, the soon-to-be Caudillo, instantly knew where to turn, and he reached out to the German military attaché in Lisbon, General Kuhlenthal, via the German Tangiers consulate. Quote, Lieutenant Colonel Beigbeder has asked me to forward the following very secret dispatch. For Military Attaché General Kuhlenthal, General Franco and Lieutenant Colonel Beigbeder send greetings to their friend, the Honourable General Kuhlenthal, inform him of the new nationalist Spanish government, and request that he send 10 troop transport planes with maximum seating capacity through private German firms, transport by air with German crews to any airfield in Spanish Morocco. The contract will be signed afterwards. Very urgent. On the word of General Franco and Spain." End quote. On the 23rd of July, this cable was received, and it eventually reached the German Foreign Ministry, who rejected Franco's appeal immediately. The bureaucrats at the Wilhelmstrasse had hung the Spanish patriots out to dry. The Spaniards, however, did not give up. In the Canary Islands, a German Junkers 52 mail plane was simply commandeered by the Spaniards, and the Spaniards reached out to the small German business colony in Tetuan. One of the men there was Johannes Bernhard, a businessman with important connections in both Spain and Germany. Another was Adolf Langenheim, a 64-year-old engineer who was the local organizer of the 33 Nazi Party members in the colony. The former offered to fly to his homeland to bypass the Foreign Ministry bureaucrats. At 5:30 p.m. on the 23rd of July, they set off aboard the commandeered Junkers. In July, on the 25th, Alfred Hess, brother of Rudolf Hess, put in a good word for his friends, and the deputy Führer quickly picked up the phone and spoke to Adolf Hitler. The Führer immediately grasped the seriousness of the mission and agreed to meet the emissaries. The party then flew on to Nuremberg in an aircraft provided by the director of Lufthansa, and then they drove to Beirut, where Hitler was attending his beloved Wagner festival. Soon enough, the two businessmen found themselves in front of Hitler, Hermann Göring, and Field Marshal von Blomberg. Within 2 hours, Hitler made his decision and blew off the advice of his entourage. He would help save the Spanish cause. Göring was ordered to make arrangements to provide the almost unknown General Franco with whatever he needed. Göring summoned the ever-reliable Milch and ordered Rear Admiral Lindau to be picked up the following morning and brought to Beirut. By the next evening, Lindau had come and gone back to Hamburg. By now, he had orders to load a cargo ship with equipment and an expeditionary force. Meanwhile, Milch had summoned a group of officers in Berlin and arranged the dispatch of 20 Junkers transport planes with fighter escorts and ground backup. The original Junkers 52 mail plane was stripped out to make room for hundreds of aviation fuel canisters, and back it went to Morocco, over and over again, carrying the vital fuel for the airlift. Captain Henke, the pilot, then began to ferry his first group of Moors across the strait to Sevilla. Franco was then brought the incredible news that Hitler had sent 20 planes rather than the originally requested 10. On the 31st of July, the last planes left Germany for Spain. One of them accidentally landed in Madrid, which was in Republican hands. Thankfully for the pilot, another German plane was there to evacuate refugees and quickly informed him of his error. He quickly took off, but didn't have enough fuel and landed at another Republican airfield where the plane was ordered to be impounded. The German ambassador had to feign ignorance and said it was a refugee plane. Michael Alpert describes the process of ferrying the Moroccans and Spanish legionnaires across the strait. Quote, "In the week of the 10th to 16th of August, nearly 8 tons of armaments and 2,853 men, or 400 per day, sitting on the floor with their rifles between their knees, had been flown, making this the first military airlift in history. The legionnaires and Moors waited, camped out on the airfield at Tetuan. Conditions were difficult. The August heat was unbearable. Aircraft flew all day, carrying men to the peninsula, so they had to be serviced at night in the light of headlights and cooking fires. The shortage of adequate equipment meant that aircraft had to be refueled with hand pumps. When the runway at Jerez de la Frontera was ready, sherry pumps were used, but they were slow and took a minute to pump 3 litres of fuel. German meticulousness had to admit that the Spanish gift for improvisation, or chapuza, was amazingly useful at times." End quote. By the 11th of October, the airlift was complete. 13,962 men had crossed the strait along with 270 tons of war material over the course of 868 flights. Only 1 plane and 2 men had been lost. This was quite the feat for the first airlift in military history. The nationalists, led by Francisco Franco in the south, now began their march on Madrid. Hitler's airlift had won them Western Andalusia and thus a shot at winning the war. The Fuhrer would later say, quote, "Franco ought to erect a monument to the glory of the Ju-52. It is the aircraft which the Spanish Revolution has to thank for its victory." End quote. Before this impressive feat, men had volunteered in Germany for service in Spain. This would be the first time since the Great War that the Germans would be able to take to the skies, albeit, this time, unofficially. If one wanted to sign up, they had to resign their commission, and they were placed in the reserve, so that if they were captured, they could insist that they were not Luftwaffe pilots. The pay was great, too. In a few months' time, you could save up perhaps 7,000 marks, a gigantic sum for a working-class man of that time in Germany. Money aside, many were enthusiastic to sign up, as A, it would look great on your record, and B, many wanted action and adventure regardless. Adolf Garland, the German fighter ace from the Second World War, would later recall, quote, "One or 2 of our comrades vanished suddenly into thin air, without our having heard anything about their transfer orders. After 6 months, they returned, sunburned and in high spirits." End quote. The men, however, were expressly ordered not to say a word about their time in Spain, and the entire operation was covered in secrecy. Officially, the Germans were there as part of the Strength Through Joy program, or some other such excuse. The huge containers of equipment were labelled as furniture. Originally, the men signing up didn't even know where they were going, simply that they were going to save a people in great difficulties from Bolshevism. The first group of men, en route via cargo ship, were told where they were going only when they were at sea. They were then told about the Spanish situation and shown evidence of the horrible atrocities being carried out in the Republican zone. They were also warned not to mess with the local women, as they could be particularly charming and the men could be particularly jealous. Most importantly, they were warned not to act like bulls in a china shop. At first, of course, the Germans' tasks were limited to transporting the Moroccans and legionnaires across the straits. The expedition did bring 6 fighter pilots, however, to teach the Spaniards how to use their new fighter escorts. Even this task, however, was not easy. Quote, "In torrid heat, the mechanics assembled the machines. The excessive speed with which the expedition had been put together meant that even German efficiency had not managed to ensure that the right tools were available, and some basic facilities were not to be found. The Germans worked with the Spanish mechanics, suffering the usual problems of mutual understanding because interpreters had not been provided. Von Schell's report to Sonderstab V was particularly critical of Spanish lack of punctuality regarding food. The Germans wanted their main meal at noon, precisely while Spanish meal times could be delayed for hours. Occasionally, German mechanics fainted in the searing heat, while hands were burned on tools which had been left in the sun." End quote. The Germans' duties quickly began to expand, as expected. In early August, their transports were attacked by the Republican Navy, and so 2 Junkers were then transferred to bomber duties in order to defend themselves. The 2 planes, on the 13th of August, hunted down the exact same battleship that had fired at them and landed a successful hit on its bridge, killing 3 men and wounding 3 more. On the 23rd of August, the same 2 transport planes headed to the Toledo Alcazar to drop supplies to the beleaguered defenders. Soon enough, the Germans were begging to be allowed to use their own fighters for combat missions, as opposed to just letting the Spaniards take the reins. The Spaniards kept crashing them and found them hard to handle, and frustration grew and grew. On the 24th of August, German fighter pilots entered combat for the first time since the Great War. It had taken barely a month for the Germans to fully involve themselves, and almost immediately the Republicans felt the difference. Day by day, the Republican Air Force was being picked off piecemeal by the Germans. On the 20th of September, the Germans took their first casualty of the war, as Lieutenant Eberhard Hefter's plane flew into the Vitoria town hall in Navarre due to engine trouble. Meanwhile, more material was arriving on a German cargo ship. The ship, due to the Republican blockade, was forced to dock at Lisbon, but Salazar, ever a great friend of the Spaniards, allowed the goods to pass through his lands to the Spanish and their German allies. The German contribution had been greatly increased due to reports that the French were supplying far greater quantities to the Republicans. After all, both nations were led by far-left Popular Front governments. Léon Blum, the Jewish Prime Minister of France, felt the Spanish cause as his own. The French issue also led to Germany quickly bringing over anti-tank units, along with Mark I Panzer tanks. By the end of October, the Germans had supplied the nationalists with 146 fighters, bombers, recon planes, and seaplanes. For the rest of the year, the German pilot's most important task was to assist Franco's march on Madrid. Lieutenant Knuppel recalls, quote, "We flew daily to and fro between Cáceres, Navalmorales and Talavera, and accompanied the Spanish columns in the Tagus Valley as they advanced on Madrid. It was here that Trautloft and Huvald brought down some enemy light bombers. This was greeted in especially lively fashion by the brave Moroccans. At Navalmorales Forward Airfield, the Moros supplied us with tea and mutton. When, after our first flight to the front in the Talavera region, we made an interim landing there for breakfast." End quote. Soon enough, though, the Spaniards and their German allies ran into trouble. The closer Franco's march to Madrid got, the stiffer the resistance became. The Republicans and their horribly organised bands of militia weren't the problem, however. The Soviets had begun to flood supplies into the country in the form of modern fighters and tanks, far better than any of the by now outdated German equipment that was being used. Once again, the Germans felt they had no choice but to up the ante. These Soviet fighters were absolutely light years ahead. The official German record openly states, quote, "With their new type of aircraft, a new phase of the air situation started," end quote. This was how the Condor Legion was born. In mid-October, Major Hermann Ploscher, a German general staff officer, was given the task of drawing up plans for this new legion. In essence, the German contribution was now going to be an actual expeditionary force who would act on their own as a single force under German tactical command, although, of course, subject to the Caudillo's desires. In November, Lieutenant Colonel Wolfram von Richthofen took field command of the Condor Legion, and then in January 1937 he became Chief of Staff to Hugo Sperrel, the Legion's commander. It would be Richthofen who would be most associated with the Legion when its name went down in the history books. His first impressions upon arrival in November were terrible. Quote, "My accommodation is a very bad room in the Hotel Andalusia. From the Versailles group, there is as yet nobody, but just some material, a part of which is already lying around at the harbour, and in an area of Talbalada aerodrome. Transport and distribution, information on the arrivals of the steamers, and loading lists are all completely unknown. The unloaded materiel is often unusable, since many of the important items are often missing. I'm greeted by the Chief of Staff, Holl, who is worn out and wants to be left in peace. I report to General Sander, who complains about the complete lack of knowledge in Berlin of local conditions here." End quote. Harro Harder also spoke of the conditions. Quote, "The situation was awful. We would welcome an opportunity to sort things out. The fighters sit here and don't go anywhere. The entire operation appears increasingly like some great escapade controlled by incompetent staff officers. Are our operations justified by results? Why can't we have better aircraft?" End quote. Conditions in Spain in general were pretty horrendous for foreigners. The nation at this time was essentially the backwater of Europe, and the roads reflected that, and wound on for miles in terrible conditions through harsh terrain. The distances at which the Germans had to operate, too, were vast. As a result, just getting equipment around, and even communication, was incredibly difficult. The harsh sun in the summer, or the freezing winds in the winter, had quite the toll on both man and machine. The most important issue to sort out immediately became obvious to Richthofen and the others. The Russian planes were simply superior to theirs. They needed up-to-date equipment. In November, Captain Knuppel, leader of the 4th Fighter Squadron, or 4 Jagd 88, spoke on his situation. Quote, "I now had to take over the leadership of the Eberhard Squadron. In the period that followed of winter 1936-37, we were pitched into all the battlefronts, and thereby got to know the whole of Spain. Leon, Burgos, Vitoria, San Sebastian, Logroño, Zaragoza, Teruel, Barahona, Avila, Escalona, Cordoba, Almorox, These were our combat airfields. The entire squadron consisted of only 35 men, but we stuck together like pitch and sulfur. The ground crews worked untiringly. Once, in a low-level attack by enemy fighters, the armourer Unteroffizier Ike, standing completely unprotected, shot down free-handedly one of the attackers with a rifle. This all goes to show how excellent the fighting spirit of our comrades was." End quote. Despite all their hard work, the Legion continued to come up short against the superior Soviet machines. Air superiority was not achieved, and in early 1937, the Germans suffered a horrifying 20% loss rate. Lieutenant Harder lamented, quote, "We were all convinced that it was madness to continue sending the HE-51s on escort missions over Madrid. The Soviet I-16s, known as Ratters to the Germans and Franco's Air Force, played cat and mouse with us. Even the Martin bombers were at least 50 kilometers per hour faster than ours. The morale of our pilots was excellent, but all the guts in the world were useless with such technical inferiority." End quote. In mid-January, Captain Meerhard von Bernegg simply drafted a report to General Spurl, stating that he would refuse to send men on missions to engage the enemy with the HE-51 anymore. Spurl, furious, rushed to meet Meerhard, but the captain remained defiant and offered his resignation if his wish were not granted. He would not be responsible for these continued suicidal conditions. Spurl stormed off and Meerhard got his way. The way the HE-51s were deployed was officially changed. They would now be used in, quote, low-level attacks against enemy front lines, end quote. In their new task, the Germans worked miracles. The Republican units were mainly militia made up of far-left extremists who had never even held a gun before the Civil War, which they had wanted so badly. Most marched into battle with their heads held high, yet when they were strafed by high-speed German fighters, they quickly forgot their previous confidence and fled. Position after position was harassed by the Germans, more often than not, sending the young anarchists and communists fleeing to the hills for their lives. In this way, the nationalists wouldn't have to storm positions in World War I style, taking heavy casualties. Often, however, the Germans would complain bitterly of the nationalists' overcautious approach, and they wouldn't take advantage of openings created by the Germans. Whilst this was going on, more modern, albeit experimental planes were beginning to arrive. The usual logistical problems persisted, however. Richthofen complained, quote, "Transport roads from the harbour to the airfield are so blocked up that the crates with the Bf-109s, locked inside the wagons for 3 days now, cannot be brought to the airfield. Everyone has now been notified. Any success likely?" End quote. These experimental planes proved rather impressive once they got going, and in March, 16 factory-complete ones arrived, ready for action. Some of the older HE-51s were then given to Spanish crews, whilst the Germans prepared to utilise their newer model, an earlier version of the ones that would fight the RAF over the skies of Britain in a few years' time. By April, the conversion to the new Bf-109s were essentially complete at a respectable pace. The tide had officially turned, and would continue to turn, as the 109s were constantly improved throughout the war. The Spaniards may have been stopped at Madrid, largely thanks to Russian aerial domination, but now the Germans would rule the skies, and the Russians had nothing to match the new planes until the very end of the war, when it was far too late. The Italians, on their own initiative, had bit off more than they could chew at Guadalajara and been beaten to a stalemate. After this, Franco accepted that taking Madrid was futile and decided to take the rest of the highly industrious north. On the 29th of March, the Condor Legion moved its staff to Navarre. On the 31st, the Nationalists were to begin their infantry offensive, and the Condor Legion were to prove absolutely vital to its success. On day one, the Germans softened up enemy targets with bombs, and then fighters moved in and began to strafe whatever remained, in what was to become a very familiar pattern. The usual issue did occur, however. Michael Alpert writes, quote, "It was this concentrated bombing and shelling very closely in front of the attacking nationalist infantry, which forced the disciplined and well-fortified defenders out of their mountainous positions. The technique required very close ground-air liaison. Specially detached German officers were required to stand side by side with the Spanish commanders of the attacking infantry. Despite this, progress was slow, and relations between the Francoist leaders and Sprell, and even with the more diplomatic von Richthofen, were not easy. The Germans seemed to demand immediate reactions from the Spanish soldiery, such as might be expected of the highly trained professional and almost gladiatorial German stormtrooper, but not of the just as valiant, though less highly trained, Spanish infantryman. In the German view, Spanish officers did not seem to possess the same level of urgency, or the same sense of timekeeping that was ingrained in the behaviour of their German counterparts." End quote. Von Richthofen recorded of the slow advance in his diary, quote, "The Reds retreat step by step with great morale and human losses, but somewhat fewer material losses. They resist and defend themselves stubbornly. Each step we advance has to be taken by force. Since some nationalist infantry advance only when the enemy is not firing, and the Spanish artillery fires too late, slowly and badly to defeat the enemy, the burden of fighting falls on aircraft, which first demoralize the enemy by causing casualties and keep them moving back, remove their will to fight, and impede supplies and movement. The efforts fall on the forward batteries, whose shots force the enemy out of their trenches and disperse them as we advance. We can do all this because the enemy does not have an air force. The few fighters they have been shot down or destroyed on the ground." End quote. Despite all the issues, Bilbao fell on the 20th of June. Before then, however, the biggest controversy of the war developed. Over the previous decade or so, Western Europe was consumed with the fear of a very specific aspect of future warfare, that being the bombing of cities. British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had proclaimed that the bomber would always get through, and this was part of the consensus opinion. In Spain, however, there hadn't been any mass slaughter of civilians from the air, as expected. From the get-go, when the Republicans had air superiority, they had bombed insurgent towns with impunity, and indeed with great inaccuracy. Later, Franco would order the bombing of Madrid, and this would only result in reprisals against the innocent Catholic or even remotely conservative populations in the Republican zone, who were often shot out of hand in retaliation. Almost as soon as it had begun, Franco ceased any form of random bombing of cities. It didn't really have a place in a civil war. This isn't how the propaganda read, however. In the north, there were plenty of bombings, but these were on purely military targets. Intention is not everything, however, and during the Spanish War especially, bombing was in its infancy. Accuracy was indescribably bad, and the inevitable happened. The Germans and Italians bombed the town of Durango, and this resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people, including 14 nuns and a priest in just one incident when their church was hit. The goal was the town's arms factories, which the bombers failed to hit. The Spaniards certainly didn't help allay the fears that civilians were deliberately being targeted. General Mola proclaimed by radio and leaflet dropped over Basque towns, quote, "If submission is not immediate, I will raze all Biscay to the ground, beginning with the industries of war. I have the means to do so." End quote. The nationalists, despite their harsh propaganda, certainly didn't wish harm on the civilian population of the Basques of all places. In Madrid, and much of the rest of the Republican zone, churches were razed to the ground and the clergy murdered. Yet up north, the Basques were devout Catholics and were uneasy allies of the far-left revolutionaries they had jumped into bed with. They just wanted independence, yet they were ideologically identical with the nationalists. Sympathy for the nationalist cause amidst much of the population was of course gigantic, and Franco, Mola, and all the others had no interest in raining bombs on their heads. Regardless, the bombing of military installations had to go on, no matter how inaccurate. Durango, even still, didn't really make the headlines. Guernica, a few weeks later however, did. Guernica was a town being used by the enemy, right behind the front, which also housed an arms industry, which most importantly produced incendiary bombs. The town was also a key road and rail junction. Lieutenant Hans Asmus recalled, quote, "All the roads joined together at Guernica, forming the artery that led across the bridge into town. Then Captain Klaus Gautlitz, the operations officer, standing with von Richthofen, drew a circle in red around the road junction and the bridge." End quote. The bombing was extremely excessive, and little regard was taken for the civilian population, who had no air raid shelters or any kind of protection. The entire town was essentially destroyed, and a ridiculous amount of firebombs were dropped on it, considering its size. A worldwide media nightmare ensued for the nationalists, and it would forever damage their reputation, and would force them to be far more careful in future. Guernica, a town holding special meaning to all Basques, was left in a smoking ruin. Despite international complications, the advance continued, and Santander fell on the 26th of August. Next up was Gijón, and the entire Condor Legion's J-88 fighter force was assembled at a single aerodrome and working themselves to the bone. Adolf Garland, the world-famous fighter ace from the Second World War, recalled of the fighting itself, quote, "Reloading the machine guns, you usually cut your knuckles open on one of the many obstacles in the unbelievably confined space of the overhead cockpit. On hot days, we flew in bathing trunks, and on returning from a sortie, looked more like coal miners, dripping with sweat, smeared with oil, and blackened by gunpowder smoke." End quote. The fighting over Gijón was intense, and the Republicans flooded in all they had to save the city. Yet, it was not enough. The Germans took heavy losses, but their superior training and aircraft won the day. The city fell on the 21st of October. Earlier, in July, there had been heavy fighting elsewhere too. The Republicans had tried their hand at an offensive, whilst the Nationalists were busy in the north. Brunet, west of Madrid, soon fell, and the Republicans made quick progress. As always, however, they failed to exploit their initial success, and Franco simply shifted forces south to deal with the issue, including many of the Condor Legion. Captain Handrick recalls the success of the German ground strafing missions. Quote, "The success of our low-level attacks was quite considerable. Spanish observers reported that on one occasion, following our low-level attacks on a 150-metre stretch of foxholes, 100 Red Spaniards had been taken care of by our machine guns. It was possible to make this determination because immediately after our attack, the foxholes were taken by Spanish nationalist infantry." End quote. As for the air war, Lieutenant Lutzow recalls, quote, "The battles on the Brunette front had reached their zenith. Despite our air superiority, the Red Bombers attacked again and again. A small group of volunteer fighters with limited means was fighting against a tremendous superiority in personnel and materiel. What made us different from our opponent was the quality of our pilots and our aircraft." End quote. As expected, the nationalists and their German and Italian allies came out on top, as was now becoming quite the theme in this war. The North had fallen, and the Republicans had failed to exploit the situation. Now, all eyes turned to the East. By the time Franco's forces were victorious in the north, the Condor Legion needed a rest. Berlin was seemingly losing interest in them, and the Germans were terribly low on spare parts. Colonel Pitcairn recalled, quote, "We had the feeling that we had been sent to Spain and then deserted. We had to bail ourselves out of a generally forgotten war." End quote. Despite this, new aircraft did continue to arrive, and all 4 bomber squadrons were equipped with the most up-to-date Heinkel 111s, and the old crafts were passed off to the Spaniards, as was always the case. As it turned out, late 1937 was a relatively quiet period, and the Legion got the rest they so desperately needed. Unfortunately for the nationalists, however, the Republicans chose to launch their next offensive in the most undesirable conditions. On the 15th of December, in the harshest period of winter in that region, the Republicans launched an attack on Tyrol, and by evening, the town was surrounded. Franco's counteroffensive began on the 19th of December, covered by his ever-reliable German allies. Within a day or two, however, temperatures were as low as -18 degrees, and the Legion's motors simply no longer functioned. On the 8th of January, in horrific conditions where hundreds suffered from frostbite, the defenders of Tyrol surrendered. The besiegers, however, now became the besieged, and by the 20th of February, the vital town was retaken. Eckhard Prieb recalls the Legion's contribution, quote, "For more than 2 months, we were engaged in a most bitter battle in ice-cold Aragon. We flew 3 or 4 ground support missions a day at very low level, strafing trenches or dropping our 6 10-kilogram bombs on gun positions or military transport. Aerial combat was left to the Bf-109s, as the Heinkels were no match for the Soviet-made Ratters." End quote. Captain Handrick, in command of the fighters, recalled, quote, "None of it believed it to be possible that in Spain it could become really cold. The scorching heat of the summer had, in fact, helped to give us the notion that we would also experience a warm and pleasant winter. Shockingly, when I made my first reconnaissance flight to the Tyrol front on Christmas Eve, the thermometer showed -18 degrees. It was especially difficult for our ground crews at Kalamocka. Night after night and hour after hour, a special group of ground staff had to rev the engine up in order to keep them warm." End quote. Franco expected help from his German and Italian allies whenever his infantry needed it, yet the weather simply did not permit this. Whenever there was a break in the weather, they did their best, but often the planes would be forced down by fierce winds and snow. Also, during this time, Colonel Richthofen said goodbye after a falling out with General Major Volkmann. He wrote home on the 11th of January, 1938, quote, "I request my release immediately. Some leave here, and then a return trip home." End quote. 2 days later, quote, "Volkmann and I must part company at the soonest possible date." End quote. On the 30th of January, he was gone and was replaced as Chief of Staff by Major Hermann Ploscher, who had originally organised the Legion. Soon enough, despite the leadership and weather difficulties, as always, the Spaniards were successful. The Republican Air Force was dropping to the Germans like flies once the weather cleared up a little. Captain Handrick recalls, quote, "None of us would have had good memories of Kalamocka had it not been for the 7th of February 1938. This was the date of a quite special triumph for my group, for we were successful in shooting down no fewer than 12 enemy aircraft, 10 Martin bombers and 2 Ratters within 5 minutes." End quote. The Republicans, as noted, had a habit of never exploiting their successes. However, Franco certainly did not have this issue. Almost immediately after reclaiming Tyrol, Franco chose to push on and split the Republicans in two. On the 9th of March at 5:30 am, the artillery barrage signalled the beginning of a new offensive. Soon enough, Franco's nationalists were marching forwards with the protective cover of German bombers, whom smashed through Republican strongpoints, sending their poorly trained and demoralised soldiers fleeing for their lives. Without losing a single bomber, the nationalist troops and the Legion destroyed 6 Republican divisions. On day 2 of the attack, the Legion targeted enemy airfields, and practically no resistance could be offered at all. The Republicans were sent into a hasty retreat, and in the entire Aragon offensive, 60 enemy aircraft were lost, half of which were destroyed on the ground, an awful lot for the war in Spain. On the 15th of April, 1938, Good Friday, the nationalists reached the Mediterranean, splitting the Republic in two. Most, at least those with a realistic view of the situation, began to understand that the war was essentially over. It was just a matter of when. Despite all this, the Republican leadership chose to make yet another gamble in their age-old strategy of launching useless offensives. The Army of the East was reformed into the Army of the Ebro, which now became the elite of the Republican Army, led by communists. On the night of the 25th of July, the Republicans took their chances, and the first units crossed the Ebro River. Their success was immediate, and many entire nationalist units were captured. Franco, however, reacted immediately as always, and rotated his divisions to face the new threat. The Republicans, in familiar fashion, did not exploit their initial success, and after a week, their attack stalled, and a 3-month slogging match ensued over this useless patch of territory that neither side was willing to let go. At the beginning of the battle, the difference between the two air forces was stark. The Nationalists, together with their German and Italian allies, had 408 aircraft, whereas the Republicans only had 250. On top of this, the Nationalist crews were more efficient and better trained than the Republican crews, and this isn't even taking into account the elite German and Italian crews. There was simply no match here, whether it be in terms of quality or quantity. Within 12 hours of the Republicans crossing, Franco's German allies had offered, and indeed provided their full support. Anti-air and artillery batteries were already en route, and bombers immediately began to hit the pontoon bridges, causing chaos to the enemy supply line. There was simply no effective way of countering this for the Republicans. Anti-aircraft guns were scarce in the extreme, and their air force was nowhere to be seen, tied up in Valencia at the beginning of the offensive. Alpert writes of the Condor Legion, quote, "The latter, well armed with fast bombers, attacked poorly defended Republican aerodromes, destroying machines on the ground, while it was not easy to find experienced pilots for the fast Katyushka bombers to bomb enemy aerodromes, which were very well protected by the German 88mm anti-aircraft guns. Bombing of aerodromes and shortage of aviation fuel also hindered the Republican effort in the air. The Battle of the Ebro had become a war of attrition, of bombing, of heavy shelling, and positions taken and retaken by savage, hand-to-hand infantry combat." For Lieutenant Colonel Ploscher, Chief of Staff to the Condor Legion, talking later to an American historian, "On a small scale, it reminded one of the battles along the Western Front during the Great War." End quote. By mid-August, the Republican Air Force had seemingly finally awoken, and they were fully engaged with the Condor Legion above the battlefields of the Ebro. As always though, the Republicans fell short with their less experienced pilots and inferior numbers. By mid-November, it was all over. The Republicans fell back across the Ebro, although in somewhat good order. Franco, as always, exploited his success. On the 23rd of December, Franco's forces pushed north into Catalonia, now that it seemed French intervention would no longer be an issue. The Germans supported them almost every step of the way, bombing as they went, spreading terror amongst the horribly disorganized Republican forces. Not a single Republican plane reared its head on Christmas Eve. It was a rout. The Condor Legion had a restriction that prevented them from fighting too close to the French border, and they stuck to their word and provided help wherever else they could. By early February, Catalonia was firmly in Francoist hands. More of the Republican Air Force had been destroyed on the ground, and there was desperate appeals to Moscow for help, which Stalin indeed provided, but it was too late. On top of this, there simply wasn't the skilled aviators to pilot them. The Republicans in general, but especially in the air, were without the slightest hope. Garcia Lascelles of the Republicans recalled seeing large cases of aircraft supplies, quote, "Why did I want them when I did not even have suitable pilots to fly them?" End quote. From here on out, Republican resistance simply melted away. It was a walkover. Province after province fell with but a whimper. The Condor Legion had done its job, and now it was almost time to return home. The Germans flew in mass formations over the many victory parades across the nation before the final one in Leon on the 22nd of May. On the 28th, the Germans said their goodbyes at Vigo. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was there to meet his victorious airmen as they docked at Hamburg. On the 6th of June, Hitler reviewed the gigantic victory parade of the entire Legion, all 20,000 of them. The 298 fallen Germans were honoured too. The Legion did not go to Spain, as is often claimed, to practice or refine their skills for a future conflict. Hitler, as we saw, genuinely did want to help Franco in his cause, even though he was also well rewarded for doing so. The lessons learned from the air war in Spain were just a consequence of the conflict, just as lessons are learned from any conflict. More importantly than anything, the experience on an individual level led to Germany having a core nucleus of men to lead the Luftwaffe in the future, and this explains a lot of their initial success in World War II, despite the disastrous leadership of the incompetent Göring. Almost all of the pilots from Spain ended up leading squadrons in the Second World War, and indeed a large number, of course, lost their lives in that brutal conflict. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you made it this far, please do leave a like, it helps immensely. Most of all though, a gigantic thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members for their continued support. It is purely thanks to their generous donation that I am able to work on these videos every day, and it means the world. Thank you.